Welcome to the Write Right Academy. I am Matthew R. Miller. I wanted to do a little exercise today with you here about how changing a few simple words or pieces of punctuation in a sentence can change the feel of the sentence and the thing you're trying to communicate to the reader. So I have three separate sentences. Let's start there. Raymond crawled into the living room. His clothes were torn. Blood was on them. Okay, so Raymond crawls, clothes are torn, blood on the clothes. Three facts. Now, if you start with just three sentences like that with periods between them, three separate sentences, or full stops, as the English say, we say period in the U.S. Raymond crawled into the living room. His clothes were torn. Blood was on them. It gives kind of a detached feel, as if the reader is observing something and is kind of serious about it, almost like Raymond is a subject in a study. What if we combine these a little bit with a conjunction? Raymond crawled into the living room. His clothes were torn and blood was on them. Now, when you put this "and" between his clothes were torn and blood was on them, it emphasizes the fact that the blood and the clothes are related. So, in other words, what it does to the reader, it kind of puts Raymond as a subject again. And now you have a little focus on the clothing. The reader says, okay, two sentences together describing the clothing. It places a little more emphasis and importance on the clothing and the state of the clothing, torn and bloody. All right? Another way, Raymond crawled into the living room and his clothes were torn. Blood was on them. Here, you're almost like giving the reader a little surprise at the end. So Raymond crawls in, his clothes are torn. All right, let's stop. By the way, blood was on them. So what you're doing almost is like a little surprise to the reader. Now, we can use a subordinating conjunction, and don't worry about the grammatical terms for what these are. What they're called doesn't matter. It's more important how you use them. So what about this? When Raymond crawled into the living room, his clothes were torn and blood was on him. Putting that "when" at the beginning of this sentence makes it seem more like a piece in an event, an action, an ongoing plot. So in other words, it's like it's flowing. When Raymond crawled, well, it kind of makes you feel like other things were happening too. And then finally, Raymond comes in. And so it gives a more fluid feeling to the reader. Now, if we want to put a conjunctive adverb, I'm going to use furthermore. Raymond crawled into the living room. Furthermore, his clothes were torn and blood was on them. Now, these conjunctive adverbs, like furthermore, they can make your writing sound a little more elegant, a little more higher register, but they also can sometimes take away from the blunt nature or the more direct nature of what you're trying to say. So in this case, you got a guy with torn, bloody clothing. I'm going to assume something really bad has happened to him, right? So when you have this furthermore, his clothes were torn and blood was on him, it almost separates the clothing and the blood from the raiment. And so be careful with these. It sounds more elegant, but in a situation like this, when you want to draw the reader in, maybe emotionally, use them sparingly. Next, we can use a preposition. Raymond crawled into the living room with torn, bloody clothes. This flows a little more smoothly, and it also makes the clothes a part of Raymond. They're no longer separate things. Raymond, and then over here the clothes. He crawled in with these torn, bloody clothing. So the clothes are on him, they're bloody, they're torn. It implies that something has happened to Raymond himself. Another way to do this is you could flip around the position of the clothes and the Raymond in the sentence. So how about this? His bloody clothes torn, Raymond crawled into the living room. This, like the one we talked about before, sounds a little more elegant, and it can be useful in descriptions. But if you overdo it, and we would call this something like the technical grammatical term here is, I guess, a nominative absolute phrase or clause, but don't worry about that. The point is that, again, how you use it. So his bloody clothes torn, Raymond crawled into the living room. Now the focus is on the clothes, the bloody clothes. The things we put in the beginning of the sentence often have more focus and emphasis than the later things in the sentence. But to me, in a situation like this, where it seems like an action or almost a horror scene, it sounds a little too erudite or elegant, and it kind of detaches the reader from the scene. Now, what we can do is another way, implant kind of the clothing into the main sentence about Raymond. So the main sentence is what? Raymond crawled. It's your subject, your verb. So what about this? Raymond's clothes were covered in blood and torn as he crawled into the living room. Now you have Raymond and his crawling being the main point, focuses on Raymond, not on the clothes, but the clothes are a part of him too, right? So what you put in the beginning of the sentence changes the focus. So saying the one before this, his bloody clothes torn, Raymond crawled, versus Raymond's clothes were covered in blood when he crawled. Do you want to emphasize the clothing or emphasize Raymond? That's going to determine which one you put first. Now, what if we kind of snazz it up a little bit? What if we add some other words into this sentence that are more descriptive, yet still tell the same basic story? How about this? Raymond crawled into the living room wearing torn clothes that were slick with blood. Okay, so now blood, slick, now you have a feeling that the blood maybe is still flowing and that there's a lot of it if they're slick. It kind of feels like painful or gross, right? So what we're doing here by adding an adjective describing the blood and making the sentence one smoothly flowing sentence without punctuation, now you are adding more description to it, you're drawing the reader in, and you're putting emphasis on the blood itself. So this would be good in a horror story. Now let's add a little bit more to that. Raymond's torn clothes, saturated with blood, left a red, oily trail behind him as he crawled into the living room. We've added more description. We've added a trail of blood behind him, which implies not only that he's been attacked recently, but that he's trying to get away from something. See, it makes it even a little bit scarier. Then finally, you could even emphasize the fact that Raymond is in big trouble by saying something like this. Raymond tried to crawl into the living room, but only collapsed unconscious onto his torn, bloody clothes. Now we've added some more description. Raymond is trying to crawl, so he's weak. He collapses. That's a problem. He's unconscious. And he collapses onto his torn, bloody clothes, almost as if they're like a pile of stuff beneath him, like he's almost a piece of trash. Now, am I reading a lot into the changing of these sentences? Sure. But this is the kind of thing that's going to draw your reader in. And there may be 1,000 more ways to rewrite this simple statement about Raymond and the clothing. The point is that you need to play with how you arrange a sentence. You need to play with conjunctions, how you join different sentences or phrases together. You need to play around with adjectives and verbs and how much of that you want to add. You need to mix up which part of the sentence comes first and which comes second, and things like that. This is going to vary your writing, and each way is going to change the feeling a little bit. And so an exercise you can do is to take a simple sentence like I did, or actually I started with 3 sentences, right? Raymond, clothing was torn, clothing was bloody. And try to rewrite it as many ways as you possibly can. Then read your different ways aloud and see what feeling you get. See what image comes to your mind, almost like it's a movie, okay? Because it's going to change the way the reader sees the book. A final little piece of advice here. When you do write, vary the kinds of sentences and the lengths that you use. So it might be okay to write 3 separate sentences. Raymond crawled into the living room. His clothes were torn. Blood was on them. Fine, but don't make the entire page just simple, short sentences, period, period, period. So you want to have some sentences shorter, some longer, some more complex, some simpler, some emphasizing one thing, some emphasizing the other. And what you're doing is kind of weaving a tapestry of words that's interesting to the reader. If you've ever read like a child's story and every sentence is like subject, verb, period on the whole page, you can tell a child wrote it, right? Because it's might be cute, okay, fine, but it's simplistic and is boring. And so vary up your sentences. And so that's my suggestion for another little exercise here. Take a simple statement or a simple scene in your mind and rewrite it as many ways as you possibly can. Read them aloud, see how they affect you emotionally, and take note of that for how you might affect the reader. I hope that helps. This is something that helps me a lot too. And it was almost kind of fun doing this little exercise, thinking of different ways to rewrite that scene. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. I'm Matthew R. Miller, and you are here with the Write Right Academy.